If you've never heard of the pro-Israel content creator Lonerbox, then good for you, because I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more moronic and risible individual than this guy. Because what Lonerbox does is he pretends to be a leftist who, unlike the radical and fringe left, has enlightened and educated takes on important geopolitical issues like Israel and Palestine, where he can understand both sides thanks to the wealth of research that he does. And I had a whole video planned out about Lonerbox's pathetic performance in a debate we had where he refused to talk about any issues of substance and spent his time obfuscating and mocking me. But then Lonerbox handed me a gift, and this was a really wonderful gift. And whilst I really don't like the guy, I do have to hand him kudos for this, because Lonerbox tried to debunk one of the most eminent theorists of settler colonialism, Patrick Wolfe, without actually knowing what settler colonialism is. And this level of confidence is truly inspiring. It really shows that if you believe in yourself, anything is possible. You may not do it well, but you can do it.
When people try to throw it into the category of settler colonialism, especially when settler colonialism is usually understood as economic projects by capitalist powers trying to plunder nations, there's so many qualitative differences that people overlook to their peril, like to their detriment.
Now, Lonerbox, if you're going to try and discredit an entire essay, it might be a good idea to first of all read that essay, but if you can't be bothered to do that, at least have a basic idea of what settler colonialism is, because what Lonerbox says here and throughout his video is not at all what settler colonialism as discussed by Patrick Wolfe actually is, because Lonerbox seems to think that it has a lot to do with the exploitation of resources, but this is the exact opposite of what Patrick Wolfe describes settler colonialism as, because what Wolfe says is that unlike classical colonialism, the kind we would think of with, say, the British Empire and India, there may have been settlers in that place, but the principal goal of Britain's colonization of the area was the extraction of resources and returning them to the mother colony. However, in the case of settler colonialism, as Patrick Wolfe argues, what the key goal is not the exploitation of the natives, although often this does end up happening. What it principally is their elimination, whether that is physically or culturally, so as to destroy the alternative society which these people propose.
Europeans went to places like Australia, North America, or Palestine, not in order primarily to exploit the natives, although they certainly did so, but that wasn't their primary intention. They went rather to replace the natives. They went to become Australians, to stay there over the generations, which is an entirely different kind of formation. The logic of settler colonialism, being a project of replacement, is first and foremost one of elimination.
And you know what's hilarious is that Wolfe actually showed how in America you could see both different kinds of colonization being present in the case of black people and Native Americans. Now what Wolfe spoke about was that in the 1920s there was a considerable amount of racial legislation passed in the United States, and perhaps the zenith and the most racist part of this was the one-drop law, which saw all people who had one drop of black blood, something that literally went further than the Nazis, meant that they were a black person. However, one of the problems was that in Virginia, many people saw themselves as being descended from Pocahontas, and so the colonial landowners were a bit worried about this. And so to spare these colonial landowners from becoming a native, what was done was something called the Pocahontas exception, which meant that you were not a Native American by virtue of having one drop of native blood. And what you see here is the difference between settler colonialism and classical colonialism expressed in the legacy of slavery. On the one hand, a black person, a human being seen as a useful source of cheap labour, needed to be maximised as property, whereas the Native American, on the other hand, who had no place within settler society because of the alternative that their existence posed, well, the law sought to eliminate them. This is how administrative means can be used to eliminate someone without actually having to do it physically.
You do gain something from looking at the settler colonial aspects of Zionism and the fact that they, again, even if it wasn't like settler colonialism and like exploiting the locals, because what they tended to do more often was they would exclude Arabs. They would exclude Arabs from working on areas that they owned. And they did that even though Arabs were willing to often work for less. So they could have exploited them, but they chose not to because they wanted that whole contiguous Jewish presence.
Now this part is so incredibly stupid, because what Lonerbox thinks here means that Israel was not a settler colony shows exactly why Wolfe calls it a settler colony. Because the Zionist project, much more than being interested in the exploitation, was interested in eliminating the alternative society proposed by the natives. They didn't want to welcome Palestinians as workers because it would undermine the Zionist project. It would make it difficult to build a Jewish supremacist state within land that was dominated by Palestinians demographically. And so what the Zionists realized that they would have to do is they would have to take small areas of land, populate it exclusively with Jewish people, and only allow them to work so they could create a high-wage society in order to prevent an alternative being proposed by the Palestinians. So rather than being an example of why this isn't settler colonialism, it actually shows you why it is. And this is something that Wolfe and other theorists who refer to Israel as a settler colony constantly highlight. And also, rather than being part of the Zionist desire for a contiguous presence, as he tries to claim, people like Zachary Luckman, a Jewish academic, has highlighted the fact that this was actually much more a response to the difficult conditions that the Zionist project met on the ground during the period of early settlement, because most of the settlers were from Eastern Europe, and even though they didn't enjoy a brilliant standard of life, the dry crop methods of farming that they practiced in Palestine simply could not create the living standards that these people had come to expect. And Luckman talks about how this developed in his review of Gershon Shafir's Land, Labour and Zionism. So Lonerbox, when you were telling me 2 weeks ago that I didn't know anything that I was talking about, can you not see how moronic you look right now? Because you don't actually have any knowledge of the theories which people are using to criticize Israel as a settler colony. Instead, you've just read a couple of pieces by pro-Israel sources who try and debunk settler colonialism without ever critically engaging with the concept.
The term colonial, but that was colonial settler. So it's from this. It's from a book called Colonial Empire, 1966. And it basically just talks about the history of colonial empires of Europe. And they talk about Portugal, they talk about Germany, they talk about France, they talk about Spain, the UK. They don't acknowledge Israel, though. And it's because, specifically, this author did not consider Israel to be settler colonial in the classical sense.
Now, once again, this part is absolutely hilarious because the confidence displayed by Lonerbox here is absolutely amazing, because he decides to highlight a work from D.K. Fieldhouse from 1966 and to say, well, this guy categorized all forms of colonialism and he didn't include Israel then, so that means Israel isn't a colony now. But the key problem with this, Lonerbox, is that the main people calling Israel a colony at this point were predominantly Palestinians who were most likely writing in Arabic, and obviously their opinion was kind of disregarded because, I mean, at that time, no one really cared about what Palestinians and Arabs more generally actually had to say about their experiences of colonization. There is an excellent essay by Fayez Sayegh published in the mid-1960s on this topic, and if Fieldhouse had seen this, perhaps he would have seen that Israel was a colony, because seemingly later on in his life, Fieldhouse did actually clearly refer to Israel as a colony. I mean, this is from his 2006 work, but what you can clearly see here is him referring to Israel as a colony. I mean, he refers to Zionists as being seen as dynamic Europeans who, as colonists, would bring energy, skills and capital to a derelict region. And he also uses the term future Zionist colonizers. So to bring up a work from 1966 and to say, well, yeah, this guy didn't say that Israel was a colony, so that means it's not now, is truly impressive, Lonerbox. I have to hand that one to you. And what Wolfe is talking about is not exactly the same thing that Fieldhouse actually spoke about in his original work. You could clearly see that if you'd bothered to read Wolfe's actual essay, rather than dismissing it and saying that it was a useless way to learn about Israel's colonization of Palestine. But the thing is that even if Fieldhouse hadn't actually said himself that Israel was a colony, It wouldn't matter, because Gershon Shafir produced Land, Labour and Zionism, which drew on Friedrichsen and Fieldhouse's typologies of colonialism to classify Israel as a pure settlement colony. And what this refers to was the pure settlement established a colony based on white labour, which together with the forcible removal of the native population allowed the settlers to regain the sense of cultural and ethnic homogeneity that is identified with a European concept of nationality. And how can you really say that this is not accurate when the slogan of one of the early Zionist political parties, Hapoel Hatzer, was a necessary condition for the realization of Zionism is the conquest of all jobs in Palestine by Jews? You literally mentioned how they excluded Arab workers even though they were willing to work for less and were more competent workers because they were used to the environment. And this would fit perfectly with the person who you try and draw on to debunk Patrick Wolfe. The mind honestly boggles. And this should also be coupled with the statement of Theodor Herzl, "I am a German-speaking Jew from Hungary and can never be anything but a German. At present, I am not recognized as a German, but that will come once we are over there." What Herzl is saying here is that by practicing colonization in the land of Palestine, he will be transformed into a European. He will get to experience European nationalism for himself. And you could also highlight the fact that Herzl talked about forming a rampart of Europe in the Middle East. And Max Nordau, another key early Zionist figure, also spoke in an incredibly similar manner. Like, honestly, sitting there and trying to say, well, Israel didn't want to bring a culture from Europe there, they wanted to bring something different, is so funny, because it doesn't align even with what the early Zionists saw. What settler colonialism really constitutes, in the words of Arij Sabbagh-Khoury, is an analytic framework that enables the examination of numerous cases, for example Brazil, North America, Canada, Israel, Australia and South Africa, although it is worth noting that Wolfe himself debated whether you could even consider South Africa as a settler colony, because in spite of the massive presence of settlers, there was also a keen interest in exploiting the local black population and extracting resources from the place. And another good reason to include David Ben-Gurion here is that Elizabeth Thompson quotes Ben-Gvir as saying that like the pioneers who settled in America, we will fight wild nature and wilder redskins. Ben-Gurion himself was already doing settler colonial theory before it even existed, because he knew clearly that, yeah, this isn't exactly the same as America, but what we are going to do there is a similar process where we will fight against nature and also the natives in order to establish a new society there. And this is also another key part of settler colonialism. How the settler sees the native society is all one. It is like a flora and fauna that needs to be removed in order for the settler society to flourish in that land. There are many differences between these settler colonies, such as the point at which settling occurred, whether they'd urbanized and created centers before, such as in the cases of Canada and Brazil, whereas in America you had people settling before you really had any kind of urban centres. And when it comes to Zionism, there are of course differences. You have the fact that there is no real one singular mother country, but settler colonial theorists tend to address this with the fact that, well, the British Empire would eventually come to back up the Zionist project and acted as a mother colony through the appointment of figures like Herbert Samuel, an avowed Zionist who openly supported the Zionist project and used his power in order to ensure that it would succeed. And so, as Zachary Lockman argues, it is very difficult to know where the Zionist project would have ended up were it not for the support of the British. Now, Lonerbox is correct to note that initially the conditions in Palestine were not conducive to Zionist settlement. In fact, Baron de Rothschild, someone who had been heavily involved in the settlement project of Algeria, had sought to revolutionise the small handful of Jewish settlements in the late 1800s. However, he quickly soured on the project as it was pretty clear that he wasn't going to make any financial return. It's why the early Zionist project floundered so much. In fact, whilst David Ben-Gurion was campaigning across America in the early 1910s, he could barely muster up 100 Jewish people who were willing to go and settle in Palestine. All of this changed, however, however, when Zionism got its imperial backer, the British. Ben-Gurion was able to convince a crowd of 2,000 people to pledge they would devote their energy to building a national home in Palestine. He managed to recruit 1,500 volunteers to depart immediately to Palestine on his first fundraising tour after the Balfour Declaration, which was of course a huge increase over the 100 pioneers he had been able to recruit over the previous 2 years. And even if you want to disregard this, what the Zionist project had was the World Zionist Organization, which was a group of international Jewish people ideologically committed to the project of Zionist colonialism in Palestine and willing to throw considerable amounts of capital at that project with no expectation of major returns. And Wolfe, the man who you dismissed, deals with this excellently. He says, first of all, always the frontier was led from behind by speculators, but also how does this have any consequence for the Palestinians? Although there was no singular mother country backing it, they still experienced dispossession in a similar way to the Native Americans and such. Although it was through purchase, there are clear examples of violence, coercion, and many other duplicitous tactics in order to expel the Palestinians and destroy the society which existed in Palestine prior to Zionist colonization.
Quotation marks mostly empty. Choo-choo train, if you can prove otherwise, that the Zionists initially mostly settled in parts of Palestine that were already inhabited in 1880 for the 20, 30, 40 years. Feel free to show me. Otherwise, just cope.
And I've decided that I'm not going to include the full segment of what Lonerbox says here, but he encourages a chatter who mocks him for saying that Palestine was mostly empty to take their own life. And I just have to say, this is a 33-year-old man. How pathetic and miserable do you have to be to respond this way to some random chatter on the internet? I have been live. People have said heinous things to me, and never would I once think, yeah, I should respond this way to a random person over the internet. It is sad and pathetic, Lonerbox. And the funniest part is that in many ways this chatter is correct, because Ahad Ham, an early Zionist settler, said that when Zionists had claimed, oh, Palestine is an empty land, there's no one living there, he said it was hard to find a space that was not owned by Palestinians. Similarly, Yitzhak Epstein, an early Zionist settler, spoke of the founding of Rosh Pina, a settlement set up in the early 1880s in the Eastern Galilee, and what Yitzhak Epstein said of the founding was, if we do not wish to deliberately deceive ourselves, we can certainly admit that we have thrown poor people out of their derelict homes and taken away their livelihood. Whence will the castaway turn with only a few coins to his name? To this day, the lament still rings in my ears, the weeping of the Arab women on the day their families left the village of Jaouni, which is Rosh Pina, to go and settle in the Hauran, which lies beyond the Jordan River to the east. The men rode the donkeys and the women followed them, walking and weeping, and the entire valley reverberated with their moans. From time to time they would stop and kiss the rocks. And also Chaim Margaliot Kalvarisky, who was the director of the Jewish Colonization Association and bought 25,000 acres in Palestine, also said of his early settlement activity in 1919, over the 25 years of my colonizing work, I have dispossessed many Arabs, removed them from their land, and you realize that this work, removing them from their land, people who were born on it, as were perhaps also their fathers, is not at all something to be trifled with, particularly as the dispossessor does not consider the dispossessed a herd of sheep, but rather human beings with a heart and soul. I had to carry out the dispossessions because the Yeshuv required this of me, but I always tried to perform this surgery easily and conveniently, so that it wouldn't be so painful for the dispossessed. I would also try to make sure that they do not leave their land empty-handed, and that the effendis, who were always the mediators between sellers and buyers, do not rob them blind. But of course, rather than confront this or even think about it, you would rather speak to someone in this way. What a moron you truly are, Lonerbox. But I would also like to say that even if this was the case, it really wouldn't matter, because clearly in the early 1900s, the Zionists moved towards the project of Hebrew exclusivist labour. They made it clear that they didn't see the Palestinians as having a part in the society that they were seeking to create. So these new settlements that they were creating in that land, eventually with the support of the British Empire and the declaration of their support for a Zionist state, clearly had the goal of not including the Palestinians within it. Their project simply couldn't have it. They needed an area that had demographic superiority of Jewish people, and so this was always going to require huge amounts of expulsions. You yourself later on in the video note, well actually yeah, settler colonialism can see this thing of, oh, you know, there was things going on before the nakba. And of course, this is what matters. This is what Wolfe talks about. It is his most famous quote: invasion is a structure, not an event. What he is saying is that you shouldn't focus on a specific event like the nakba. It is the structure that the early Zionist settlers laid down that clearly had no place for the Palestinians, and they openly avowed as colonialism that was the genesis of the mass expulsion of Palestinians in 1948.
Comparing Gaza and the West Bank to the Warsaw Ghetto. Famous. This is a year after Israel pulled out of Gaza and 1 year before the blockade, 2006. The blockade was 2007. He's calling it the Warsaw Ghetto. So this guy is a bit of a I think you're not going to learn that much about the nuances of Zionism and the Israel-Palestine conflict if you learn this about colonialism. This is a essay for that.
And this part of Lonerbox's video really irked me as well, because Lonerbox tries to discredit Patrick Wolfe because he mentions the Warsaw Ghetto, but he doesn't even contextualise what Wolfe is actually saying, which is nonetheless, as Palestinians become more and more dispensable, Gaza and the West Bank become less and less like the Bantustans and more like reservations, or for that matter like the Warsaw Ghetto. Patrick Wolfe is clearly not saying that the Gaza Strip is currently like the Warsaw Ghetto. What he is saying is that it could end up like that because Zionism has an increasingly lessening dependency on the Palestinian people as a source of labour. Because as Sarah Roy has noted, Israel absolutely destroyed the economy of the Gaza Strip by using it as a cheap source of labour. But then eventually Israel had less and less need for these people, and so increasingly they became a surplus population with no real value to Israel, apart from posing an obstacle to the establishment of a Jewish state over all of historic Palestine, something which the Likud party openly talks about, and something which is clearly not opposed by Israeli society as a whole, because most of them support the mass expulsion of 2 million Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. And what this actually represents when you think about it is a rather chilling prediction, and it's not surprising when it came, because this was just after the Second Intifada, when Israel levelled large parts of the Jenin refugee camp in response to massive Palestinian resistance within the area, which by the way is something which under international law Palestinians should have the right to do, because Israel is undeniably an occupying power.
كل ما نبني عيش ينخربوا لنا اياه، كل ما نبني بيت ينهدموا لنا اياه، كل ما نخلف ولد قتلوا لنا اياه. شو ظل لنا؟ شو ظل؟ قتلوا الامل، قتلوا زهرة الحب اللي بقلبنا. شو ذنب العمارات هاي؟ شو ذنب؟ شو ذنب الولد اللي مات؟ لسه بنطول شهداء من تحت الأنقاض.
But what Wolfe saw was something different to South Africa. This is absolutely undeniable, because whilst the colonization of South Africa was undeniably brutal, they still relied on the native population. At no point did they engage in huge destruction of Bantustans in the same way that Israel has been engaging in huge destruction of Palestinian areas. And the Gaza Strip does indeed have comparisons to the Warsaw Ghetto, because what the Nazis actually did to Warsaw, according to the records kept by Edelman, was that following fierce Jewish resistance, the Nazis realised that they just weren't going to beat them without a huge cost, and so they set fire to the entire Warsaw Ghetto, so that life was impossible there. And is that not what Israel has done to the Gaza Strip? They've consistently let their soldiers burn down massive amounts of Palestinian homes, residential buildings, and also civilian infrastructure. They've bombarded it for well in excess of 18 months, and they've randomly blown up civilian buildings with no military purpose simply because they could. And you sit there and act as if this is some kind of disgusting red flag, when it is first of all not a direct allusion to the Warsaw Ghetto at that point. And secondly, it is also a relatively accurate prediction. And I mean, this is just indicative of Lonerbox's argument. He has not read this essay. He cannot confront the actual substance of it, and so he just goes after a couple of quotes. And he does the same with this quote by Herzl.
As Herzl, founding father of Zionism, observed in his allegorical manifesto/novel, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. And it's like, wow, this just sounds like nakba, right? This just sounds like blowing up a village and replacing it with a Jewish community, right? These prefatory remarks are merely intended as a hasty reply to the massed objections which the very words Jewish state are certain to arouse. Henceforth, we shall proceed more slowly to meet further objections to and explain in detail what has been as yet only indicated. And we shall try, in the interests of this pamphlet, to avoid making it a dull exposition. Short aphoristic chapters will therefore best answer the purpose. If I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. I shall therefore keep to this natural sequence. In the first and general part 1 shall explain my ideas, remove all prejudices, determine essential political and economic conditions, and develop the plan. And then he goes on to talk about the Jewish question. He's not talking about planning to destroy Palestinian buildings. He's talking about dismantling pre-existing Jewish opinions about emancipation and argue why they're wrong and why a Jewish state is what would actually ensure survival, not assimilation. He's not saying anything about, but that this Patrick Wolfe guy just grabs this to say settler colonialism destroys to replace. Like, it's such a bad faith quote, and it's you cannot do this by accident. This is completely intentional.
But Wolfe literally refers to it as an allegory, as if it had a hidden meaning, so the specific context of where it was actually said wouldn't matter all that much. And even then, if you read on just the tiniest bit, you can see he says, in a kind of realization that took place half a century later, the one-time deputy mayor of West Jerusalem, Meron Benvenisti, recalled, as a member of a pioneering youth movement, I myself made the desert bloom by uprooting the ancient olive trees of Al-Basar to clear the ground for a banana grove, as required by the planned farming principles of my kibbutz, Rosh Hanikra.
He alludes to differences between Zionism and other forms of European colonialism, like in the sense of like renaming places to Hebrew names is actually more like old biblical names rather than trying to just like, you know, like if they come from Europe, right? There's no like new Moscow, okay, or new Odessa in Israel, right? It's things like that, or the idea that it's not just like bringing the culture of a mother country into the place that you're coming from. It's a bit different from that, right? But he alludes to these differences, but he doesn't really highlight them at all. Like, he still just tries to shoehorn Israel into all these other different colonialisms of Europe and America and everything else.
And I mean, this part as well is just so utterly ridiculous. Lonerbox, you didn't bother to read the essay. I mean, this is a minute point, but you're like, oh, he's trying to shoehorn things in on this topic of renaming. But he is noting a specific difference here between the case of Australia, where settler anxieties dominated, and they chose to revert to some of the indigenous names because of the anxieties that they experienced about being too close to the British, whereas in the case of Israel, that wasn't possible. But he also notes how Zionism also needed to portray itself as different from Europe in other ways, such as the adoption of the language of Hebrew. Most Jewish people there would have spoke Yiddish or some other language from Europe, and yet David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first leader, banned the speaking of any other language within key political parties of the Zionist project. He didn't want it because he knew in order to form a cohesive nationalism, they needed a shared language, even though none of them could actually speak it. They didn't bother learning Arabic, which would have allowed them to communicate and perhaps even dominate over the natives better. They chose to learn Hebrew because it would distance them from European Jewish people. But still, as I noted previously, this doesn't mean that Israel didn't bring with it European culture. As their early founders put it, that is exactly what they wanted to do. And they built European-style cities within that land. They planted European-style trees within that land. So this idea that they didn't bring the culture of Europe is fundamentally ridiculous, especially as I noted in my previous video, that Israel and its first leaders like David Ben-Gurion Palestinian often said that they wanted to distance themselves from Arab culture, even in the case of the Mizrahi Jewish people brought over from Arab countries. They openly spoke about how much they didn't like it. And not even just him. Ahad Harm, Asher Ginsberg, who I mentioned as well, also said very similar things about his distaste for non-Ashkenazi Jewish culture. Wolfe is not trying to shoehorn them in by highlighting different aspects of colonialism. What Wolfe is actually doing is showing how the theory of settler colonialism, the idea that settler colonial societies are premised on the elimination of the native people and the alternative society that they propose, is an effective means for comparing disparate examples which do have their own particular uniquenesses. But of course, for Lonerbox, because he hasn't read the essay, he doesn't actually know what Wolfe is talking about.
Book where they basically describe Zionism as pure colonial movement, as pure colonial settlement. But then they do a footnote where they say there are caveats. They do a footnote where they say there are salient differences, which are Zionism's nature as an ethnic national rather than an economic project, the refugee status of most of the Jews who came to Palestine, the loose organization of the diaspora Jewish communities as opposed to a well-organized colonial mother country, and lastly, the ideal of the return of Zion, which is grounded in Jewish tradition. So they say it's colonialism, but all these very, very crucial things that make it fairly qualitatively different from your average European colonial project.
All of these differences highlighted by Oren Yiftachel really don't actually change it. Israel was still a project that sought to eliminate the Palestinian people. You can see, as I've highlighted, how throughout Wolfe's other work, he discusses this, and he is not the only settler colonial theorist who has actually talked about this. There were other people who fled persecution, religious persecution, who moved over to America and became settlers. Sure, it wasn't on the scale of Israel, but does it change their relationship to the native population as settlers? No, they were still settlers who went over to that space. Of course, there are differences. No one is claiming that this is a one-to-one example, but what they are saying is there is this overarching structure that you can note from all settler colonies, which shows a clear focus on the goal of eliminating the indigenous population of that land. And even then, most likely what this person is referring to, although I can't find Yiftachel's work that this actually comes from, because there's not a citation in that article, probably comes from Friedrichsen and Fieldhouse's categorization of different types of colonization. And this person is noting what the differences are between the examples highlighted by Fieldhouse and Friedrichsen and what they see as pure settlement in Israel. It is not talking about Patrick Wolfe's concept of settler colonialism. And it's also worth adding here that if he is indeed drawing on Fieldhouse and Fredrickson's categorization and typologies of colonialism, then it wouldn't be all that surprising, because as Gershon Shafir has noted, they themselves said that colonialism was not made of one cloth. So highlighting differences between different examples of colonialism is hardly surprising. Across every single expression of it, there were many differences. It is not one uniform thing. And perhaps Lonerbox, if you actually did some research rather than watching YouTube videos whilst playing World of Warcraft and going on propaganda trips to Israel, you might actually start learning what you're talking about.
You can't say there's no colonialism or no settling from Zionism. That's ridiculous. Of course they settled. Of course they were colonizing to some extent. Of course they evicted people. They might not have planned in advance to do the nakba, but they did do it, right? And they had those ideas swimming around in the back of their minds for quite a few years before they actually did it. Like, the idea of forced transfer didn't come out of nowhere. It didn't just come as a spontaneous response to military need, right? That's not how it worked.
And again, Lonerbox, you are so close to getting it, but of course, your pro-Israel stance will never let you. The whole point of Patrick Wolfe's argument is that you should understand the process of settler colonialism as a structure, not an event. These early points of Hebrew exclusivist labour were the genesis of the expulsion of millions of Palestinians. They were not something random, as you are willing to note. You note that it doesn't come out of nowhere. You do say that it may not have been pre-planned, although although there is quite a lot of evidence that it was pre-planned, drawing on Ilan Pappé's work and highlighting things like Plan D, Plan Dalle, and also Tom Segev, who notes the lightning speed at which it was done means that it could not have been something that was not pre-planned. However, what is clear is that if you had just bothered to read Wolfe's work, you might have actually got something from it, but you dismissed it outright for reasons that don't even align with what Wolfe is actually trying to say. And initially, the video I planned to make about Lonerbox was relating to our debate and the concept of theory versus facts in the Hegelian sense, why theory is way more important than facts. However, what I will still say here is that my point remains. Throwing out random facts and going, well, this thing happened, just to obfuscate the overarching truth that Zionist settlers came to Palestine, expelled the Palestinian people, and clearly, even in the very early period, had the trappings that this was going to be something much bigger. You have to sit there and say, well, actually, this theory's useful. But you would never know that because you're not going to read a book about this. You'd rather just do research on your Twitch stream and talk about things that fit with your narrative. And that's why you're never going to be pro-Palestine or be able to offer any reasonable criticism when you clearly could not even be bothered to read Patrick Wolfe's essay.